Hello everyone, this is Professor Hasselman, History 105 Online, and today we're going to talk about the American Revolution. So this week we've talked about the Ancien Regime, and we've talked about the Enlightenment and despotism in Europe. And then 2 weeks ago we talked about all the European wars, the 9 Years' War, the 7 Years' War, the War of the Austrian Succession, the War of the Spanish Succession, and we ended with the 7 Years' War and what happened in 1763 with the Treaty of Paris and the ending of the strife between Britain and France. Today we're going to look at it from a different perspective, and we're going to look at it from the Americans' perspective, an outreach of Western civilization, if you will. So the American Revolution was a direct result of the decisions taken in the wake of Britain's victory in the Seven Years' War. In 1763, at the end of the Seven Years' War, Britain was more or less declared the winner of the race for the empire in North America. France lost all its American colonies, which led to a feeling of national humiliation and resentment, and this in turn spurred reforms to the French war machine. Now, Britain, on the other hand, gained a vast empire, but also the problem of defending it. The situation was complicated by the wide variety of types of governing arrangements and cultures. The 13 British colonies, with a population of 2.5 million Europeans and Africans, were not accustomed to much interference or taxation from London. To the west, thousands of indigenous peoples had allied with the French in previous wars. And to the north and west, there remained some 65,000 French or French-speaking settlers, mostly settled around Quebec. Spain also retained a vast empire to the south and west of the Mississippi. Now, after 1763, Britain fought to pacify or contain three groups. In 1763, a royal proclamation recognized indigenous Indian sovereignty, angering many British colonists. The 1774 Quebec Act reaffirmed the old French legal system, the seigneurial system. It recognized the Catholic Church and restored to colonists the lands between the Ohio and Mississippi that had been given in 1763 to Indians. Now, this reconciled many French people to British rule, but it too produced resentment in the 13 colonies where the Quebec Act was viewed as favoritism. Now, the British colonists on the eastern seaboard and in the West Indies possessed little collective consciousness. Rather, they had their own individual histories, populations, economies, and cultures. Now, generally, the latter economies thrived. The West Indies relied on sugar. In the South, the plantation slave economy relied on the cotton export, or the export of cotton, tobacco, rice, and corn. The North produced rum and refined sugar for England and ships for the colonies. The British during this time generally took a hands-off attitude towards these economies. The Navigation Act kept foreigners out. Crown taxes were low or non-existent, and central rule was light, and each colony had an assembly that controlled expenditures. Now in the 1680s, James II tried to run the colonies more closely, consolidating northern colonies into a Dominion of New England under a governor, Sir Edmund Andros. However, James II was overthrown in 1688, and William III restored the powers of the assemblies. Now, British policy toward the 13 colonies on the eastern seaboard changed after the 7 Years' War. The British, fearing a French resurgence with Indian help, decided to require American colonists to pay for their own protection. The Stamp Act of 1765 required all public documents to have a stamp, purchased from the government. Now, many colonists saw this as an arbitrary imposition of taxation. Colonial assemblies condemned the act. The Sons of Liberty encouraged physical violence against stamp offices and collectors, and the Stamp Act Congress urged merchants to refuse British imports and colonists to refuse to use the stamps. In 1766, at the behest of British merchants, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act. Parliament then passed the Declaratory Act in the same session, asserting its right to legislate for the colonies. The next decade after Parliament passed taxes as much to prove that it could do so as to raise money. The colonists would eventually object, and Parliament would repeal the tax, but later another to defend the principle. Now, following the Boston Tea Party of 1773, the British government reacted with the Coercive Acts of 1774, closing the port of Boston, depriving the Massachusetts legislature of power, and allowing for the billeting of soldiers on the public. On the night of 19th of April 1775, British troops were ordered to secure a store of guns and ammunition assembled by the colonists at Concord, Massachusetts. A group of colonists, warned by Paul Revere, fought back, firing on British troops at Lexington, then Concord. Now, the American Revolutionary War has sunk into our collective popular consciousness as a story of brave colonists standing up against overwhelming odds to the might of ruthless King George and the British Empire. Now, the balance of advantages and disadvantages tipped towards the Americans. It's true that the American colonists began the war without a central government or professional army or navy. The British, with a population of 9 million strong, had the best navy in the world and an army hardened on the plains of Europe and its forests of America during the 7 Years' War. The British forces, though, would be fighting far from home against the people defending their own homes, and in their view, their own way of life. Now, intelligence to and orders back from Britain took 6 weeks to cross the Atlantic round trip. Now, for once, the British would have no allies of consequence. The French would, in 1778, see an opportunity for revenge. And just as the colonists were disunited between revolutionaries and loyalists, or Tories, so many Whigs in Parliament, including Edmund Burke, opposed the war as unnecessary, expensive, and an attack on fellow Englishmen defending English freedoms. Now, perhaps this is the point that Americans miss the most about the American Revolution. For all the financial and naval help of the French, the Revolution was fought by landowners and businessmen, little different from English country gentlemen or London and Bristol merchants, over many of the same issues that had led to the British Civil Wars of 1637 to 1660 and the Glorious Revolution of 1688-89. Now, when the colonists rebelled against King George, they claimed to be doing so in defense of English liberties, citing the martial law and billeting provisions of the Petition of Right of 1625, free trade with the empire as represented by the Navigation Act, and above all, the principles enshrined in the English Declaration of Rights in 1689, and in the Englishmen, and that Englishmen could not, be taxed without his permission. Now, the war lasted from 1775 to 1783. The Revolution began badly for the colonies. In June of 1775, the British broke a colonial siege of Boston, only to abandon the city in March of 1776. In July of 1776, the colonies declared independence, but a British force captured New York. On Christmas night, 1776, Washington launched a surprise assault on Hessian mercenaries at Trenton for a needed psychological victory. And it was Benedict Arnold's resistance in upstate New York that kept the British from driving to Canada. Now, the year 1777 was the crucial one of the war. That summer and fall, a large British force under General John Burgoyne, sweeping down from Canada, was defeated by American forces at Saratoga, New York. At the urging of Benjamin Franklin, this convinced the French government to send military and financial support. Now, having lost the North, the British instead captured Savannah, Georgia in December of 1775, and most of South Carolina by the spring of 1780. American forces, though, launched an effective guerrilla war against the British. In 1781, Washington, reinforced by French troops under the Marquis de Lafayette, encircled the last British army in North America at Yorktown, Virginia. It took 2 more years to bring His Majesty's government representatives to the table, but peace, and a recognition of American independence, was reached at the Treaty of Paris in 1783. Now, the American Revolution had profound effects not only on our history, but on that of Europe as well. The American Revolution and Constitutional Convention of 1787 were important in Europe because they demonstrated that Enlightenment ideals could be put into practice. America is a nation that created itself by a Declaration of Independence that followed Locke in arguing that government is instituted by the people in a contract to protect their lives, liberty, and property, and that they can revoke that contract when a government fails in those responsibilities. The Americans followed Locke in 1787 in instituting a new contract, the U.S. Constitution. They followed Montesquieu in establishing a government separating and balancing its powers among three branches. They followed Voltaire in establishing freedom of expression and religion, and failing to establish a state church. They followed Rousseau in establishing a wide franchise, adult, propertied free males, and reserving political power to more localized communities or states. And they perhaps also followed an implication of Rousseau's thought that in allowing the majority white population to declare black slaves 3/5 of a person. Now, despite many difficulties, including tremendous financial hardships and inflation after the war, the immediate loss of export trade to Britain, the immigration of maybe 100,000 productive citizens, Shays' Rebellion by Massachusetts farmers unable to pay their debts, two things saved the Republic: the 1787 Constitution and the prestige and steadying influence of George Washington. Now, the loss of America was a blow to British prestige, but trade with America soon recovered. Whigs launched the economical reform movement to make the British government cheaper and more efficient. The war gave a spur of electoral reform in Britain, and Britain still retained Canada, which supplied furs and timber, and the West Indies, which supplied sugar and, of course, received the slave trade. British manufactured exports continued to grow after the war, even though manufactured exports from the United States to Britain were stagnant until 1790 and didn't really start growing again until 1800. Now, in other words, Britain got all the benefits of colonial ownership without any of the responsibilities like defending the colonies. Now, France, after all of this, experienced the heady enjoyment of victory over the British. But the American War plunged the French monarchy into bankruptcy by the end of the 1780s. Thus, the American Revolution paved the way for the French Revolution, which we'll be talking about next week. So this is the end of today's lecture, and some things to think about when you after listening to this is: was the British demand that Americans pay for their own defense unreasonable? And was the American claim to be defending British and European liberties reasonable? Now, often people argue that the war was strictly over taxation without representation, but did the British have just means to tax the colonists to protect them against the French, the Spanish, and the Indians? Like I said, next week we'll be talking about the French Revolution, and we'll be talking about the development of constitutional systems and different systems that develop after the end of the French monarchy. This is the end of today's lecture on the American Revolution, and this is History 105 Online.